thank you very much for coming along today. It will be a really fabulous panel. And I have with me, next to me is Dee Lestari. Dee is a literary superstar in Indonesia. She has written the series, a very well-known science fiction series, Supernova, of which the first one, which she wrote in 2001, has been translated into English. That's called The Princess, the Knight and the Falling Star. And there's now 6 books in that series, is that right? The
6,
Supernova series, yeah. She is also a singer and a songwriter. And yesterday, Dee's most recent book, Tanpa Rencana, which means without plans, was published. And we'll talk about that soon.
Yes.
And then Laura Elizabeth Woollett. Laura is the author of 3 novels and a book about short stories. And her most recent book, which is West Girls, which I love, and I've got multiple copies that I've lent to everyone. And that has actually just been longlisted for the Stella, is that right,
yeah.
this year, which is incredible, yeah. And, yeah. And Kylie Needham. Kylie is an award-winning screenwriter who has written lots of the shows, if you're Australian, that you'll know, TV shows, including Crownies and Offspring. And she is also an author of The Girl in a Pink Dress, which won the Mud Prize, which was awarded at the Adelaide Festival. Is that right? So, yeah, we have a stellar panel, no pun intended. But I wanted to start with you, Dee.
Yes.
So, in 2001, you wrote your breakthrough novel, which was, in English, The Knight, the Princess and the Falling Star. And it's a fascinating kind of mix. It's almost like you've invented a genre of writing. So it includes quantum physics, a love story, spirituality, philosophy, science fiction. And it's also quite meta in that the actual story is written by 2 homosexual men, 2 gay men, and they're writing about a heterosexual love story. So I guess, what was the inspiration? How do you kind of invent a genre of writing?
Oh my God. we talk about this in the green room, and I said, Jewel, I wrote this 25 years ago. I probably forgot the reason why I wrote it in the first place, because it was such a long time ago. But just imagine a 24-year-old woman who had some sort of a spiritual epiphany a year before, is trying to convey to the world, this is my new spiritual insights, but what can I do about it? And I always love writing. I've been writing since I was small, but I've never published anything before that. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna write my first novel. I like love story, let's put that in. And I was very fascinated with quantum physics at the time. Let's put that in. And then, I want to portray a universal love, not bound by any orientation. Okay, let's put homosexual couples and heterosexual couples. And then, let's see. Okay, what about one protagonist, a very contradictory one. She's a prostitute, but very intelligent. Yeah, let's create that one. So I just, with all these mixes of different things, and somehow I managed to put them together in one story. So it's a very weird book. But somehow, I have my readers, and I think at that time, the contemporary Indonesia's literary scene was in some sort of a stagnate period. We didn't have much going on because of the political repression during the New Order, and I think 1998 was when that curtain started to lift off. It was pioneered by Ayu Utami's book, Saman. And we're actually going to talk about this, but I just want to share with you that Ayu is also joining us in this year's festival. her publication, Saman, boosted my confidence because her work is very different from the other, the older Indonesian works that I read. So it kind of gave me the courage and inspiration to publish my weird manuscript. And I thought, okay, if someone can take Ayu's work, Saman, I think somebody else out there can take my work, And then it was a huge success. It was beyond my expectation. I think I sold 7,000 books in 2 weeks. Wow. And even on that time standard, it was huge, very, very huge. So I didn't expect it that, this weird book suddenly have its own readers. And I couldn't really classify what that was. I think we just, made the consensus, let's just call it science fiction from now on. But looking back at it, I wasn't even aware of what this work is all about, actually. But I think what I was trying to convey is my spiritual insights at that time, the kind of the perception of world and love and humanity in the 25-year-old Dee Lestari at that time. So it was an innocent attempt, actually, that turned out to be quite success. And here I am now, still writing vigorously. And yeah, so that book really opens up my world. Yeah.
So 25 years later, you've written another book about love, Tanpa Rencana, and this time the protagonist is in her 40s.
Right.
You were saying it's a much more realistic style of writing.
Yes.
Sort of how does this book reflect how your own views of love have evolved?
Oh, wow. It had evolved a lot. And my readers who grew up with me would notice the difference, I think, because I think in Supernova, I tried to portray this ideal world of, of what love should have been, of this universal interconnectedness, dynamic between humans, the urban people of Indonesia. And now, when I'm, I have my marriage, I have my children, I lost my husband 2 years ago. It kind of shaped me and matured me in a way that now the world is still similar, it's still the same, but I kind of see it from a different light. And I think that my new book, Tanpa Rencana, or Without Plans, portray that perfectly. I think this is the first time where I have my main characters in their late 40s, the same age where I'm now at. So it's very interesting. I think I looked at love and life very differently. I think we have the song by Johnny Mitchell, I looked at life from both sides. No. I think I experienced that somehow right now. So I really enjoy that book.
Mm-hmm. I can't wait to read this
one.
We'll talk more about translations later.
Yes.
Laura, with your book West Girls, one of the things that fascinated me about West Girls is that it's really primarily a book about women's relationships with each other, and there are two main characters, Luna and Caitlin, who have a very obsessive, quite destructive relationship, but it's almost like, it really is like a love-hate relationship, really. Mm. I'm interested, there's this fantastic line in your book, which is, it says, women are capable of hurting each other in far more inventive ways than men hurt us. Why is that, do you think?
Well, Luna and Caitlin meet as teenagers. They both go to the same high school. They're both from different groups within that high school, but they come together through teen modelling and develop a friendship, which later turns quite romantic. But I think with these girls, there is, they're both queer, but they're living in a time when I get in a social setting where it's very heteronormative and they're very preoccupied with these standards of beauty and fitting in, but also with being exceptional by the standards of that society, which means, primarily like thin, conventionally beautiful. So they're women or girls who, in a way, sort of police each other. They all want to succeed within that society and have status, and that means they can be really judgmental of each other, even when there is that romantic attachment. And I think with the line where women hurt each other in far more inventive ways than men hurt us, that came for me from a sense that as a woman, you're often taught not to trust men growing up, like, beware of strange men, and in a way, like, the expectations for men are sometimes lower, whereas with other women and girls, there's, we value female friendship and we expect a sense of solidarity, but there can also be beneath the surface of that an unwillingness to let go of our own position and our own power, and that can lead to, I guess, these girls sort of judging each other a bit more harshly, and when they fail to meet those standards, sort of taking each other up. And but I think the expectation of solidarity, when that isn't there, that hurts more, because we actually do value other women, and we do sort of expect a sense of support and nurture, but it isn't always there, and in a way that hurts more, I think.
Yeah, the betrayals seemed far more devastating, I think, in your book, when, the way that women betrayed each other, really, and were cruel to each other. Yeah. And I was also interested, they were fiercely competitive, these characters in West Girls, but I wasn't quite sure, it was interesting what they were competing, and I don't know if they knew that, but what they were competing for, because they weren't really interested in the male gaze. Men were almost irrelevant in your book. And so it was sort of, what do you think that they were, why were they competing so ferociously against each other?
Well, this book sort of came from the fact that my previous books were a bit more focused on heterosexual relationships, and people would really focus on the men overtly in those books, even when there were other things going on. Like my first collection of short stories was called The Love of a Bad Man, and that was all about these women who are in relationships with notorious bad men from history. And I wrote a couple of other books which were really examining misogyny through men, and relationships between women and men, and the hurt that can happen in those relationships. And I felt like there were other things going on in those books besides that, but people tended to focus on those, the bad men and what they do to women. And I think I got a little bit bored of that, so I wanted to write a book that was more exclusively focused on women's relationships with one another, whether they're mother-daughter relationships or professional relationships or friendships, or friendships that have that romantic angle in them, as well as Luna and Caitlin's does. And in a way, I think with Luna and Caitlin, the thing is, Caitlin is actually the character who allows Luna to get her foot in the door with teen modelling. She kind of supports her in a way, and in a way wants to succeed, and really admires her beauty and is really awestruck by it, because there is that attraction between them as well. But at the same time, they are presenting as hetero women, and I think wanting that status. And there can sometimes be a sense that, with other women and girls, that there's just not enough room for us all to succeed. The positions and of power and whatever are limited, more so than for men, and that can lead to a sense of competition. And that's something I've encountered in my own life, whether in friendships or professional settings. Women can be reluctant to defer to other women sometimes in a way, like, whereas if there's a male boss, sometimes less so, which is, in 2024 quite depressing, but that is still a situation sometimes. But I think they're competing essentially for power, for currency in the world that we live in, which is a really imperfect world.
Yeah. Kylie, your book, Girl in a Pink Dress, is a fascinating insight into the sexual politics of the art world. And you have this character, Clem, whose father was a very famous artist. He's kind of notorious. He's, he's a kind of guest lecturer at the art school that Frances, the protagonist, the girl in the pink dress, is attending. And they end up having, a very passionate love affair or a relationship. And it's fascinating because although ultimately kind of she is subsumed by the relationship, it is implicit in the book that in fact she is the more talented artist. And I guess I was interested, are there any particular female artists who were mythologised as muses who you drew on their lives when you were looking at this, raising questions about whether women can be creatives in their own right, I guess?
So definitely there were two in particular. I really wanted to look at a relationship between two artists practicing the same art form. So I chose painting. I'm not a painter myself, but I remember reading, I've done a lot of reading about artists, particularly women artists who interest me. And the relationship between Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock was one that stood out to me because she was regarded as the more talented, more gifted artist to begin with. She fell madly in love with Jackson Pollock and then came to believe that his genius was such that she should sublimate her own art practice. And there's a real sadness to that, I think. And her own artwork was not really acknowledged until there's this sad story. Finally, MoMA in New York put on a show of her work, a solo show, when she was in her 70s, and she died just a month or two before she could go. So there was her, and there's also Celia Paul was very interesting. So Celia Paul, probably not many of you will know who she is. She's an artist in her 60s, a British artist. She's much better known as being the lover and muse of Lucian Freud. Most people have heard of Lucian Freud. So she in her 60s is still trying to sort of shed this label of being this older artist's lover and to have her own artwork seen for its own merits. So that was very interesting to me. I wanted to create a kind of a relationship between two artists. I wanted the love and the passion and the desire between them to be real from both sides, but I just felt like it was going to combust, and so the story is really, in some ways, quietly moving towards this point of combustion for the relationship and other things.
And when we had a coffee, you were saying that even while you were writing this, you knew that something incredibly dramatic, it's probably the most dramatic scene in the book, was going to happen, but it actually came to you on the day that you wrote it. Is that?
Yeah, it was the night before. It's very strange. So I did know that I wanted some sort of climactic event to happen between these two. The relationship was just so incandescent that it was going to have to explode in some way. And I remember for weeks actually thinking, but I don't know what the terrible thing that happens is. I'm not much of a planner with what I write. I had a landscape, so I had this very remote, cold mountain town where I knew that they were staying. And I had these two characters, Frances, who's quite quiet and underconfident, and Clem, who is just a total extrovert, very sure of his capacity. And I just didn't know how it was all going to come to a head, and then just the night before it just clicked. And I think there's something about that for me, if I didn't know what was going to happen, I really hope that for a reader they don't really see what's coming either, because I truly did not know. It was like the characters took over the story at that point, and they told me what was going to happen.
So there's a scene in the book, so Clem, who is the kind of charismatic artist that Frances is having a relationship with, his father is a very famous artist, Albert, and Albert recognises Frances's talent and I suspect believes that she's more talented than his own son. Yeah. But there's this quite chilling scene where he warns her against becoming pregnant. Like he says, don't have a child with my son because, how many famous female artists do you know who've had children? Ultimately, she did. She separated from Clem and had a child. She never really became famous, and there's this very sort of sad line that really stayed with me in the book about how her own daughter says, "You're a line in Dad's Wikipedia page." So ultimately, she doesn't become famous. Is that partly, do you think, because she did end up having to do that juggle as a woman and have a child, or?
So that scene you're referring to occurs at a dinner. So Albert is a very established, very entitled, award-winning painter in his 60s. And he does see that Frances is gifted, more than his own son. And I think his own son feels that too. So again, there's this friction in the relationship. And he says to her that she basically is going to have to choose between having a child or being a painter truly, because he believes it's an all-consuming thing. You have to give yourself to your art. And he says, really, one will murder the other. You have to choose. He says, it's not fair. And from his point of view, I think he thinks he's being kind. He thinks he's doing her a kindness, saving her the trouble of having to work this out for herself. And because he believes in her promise so much, he doesn't want to see that happen to her. But I think Frances has other ideas. I don't think she sees these things as quite so mutually exclusive. And it's tricky for her because in the book, she runs through a list of artists that she admires, female artists that she admires, and she thinks, now that one didn't have children, chose not to. That one couldn't have children, so could devote herself to her art. But she's looking at a whole bunch of them and she's thinking, look, there's something else here that they didn't have besides a child. And some of them just didn't have a husband. They had chosen not to devote themselves to a relationship either. So they could, because they found that was perhaps just as intoxicating, but drew on them as much as having a child. So I'm not so sure that it's a child that's always the problem. I think sometimes if you're in a relationship and your partner is not supportive, whatever gender, however it's worked out, that's going to inhibit your creative practice. But if you have a partner who wants to see you achieve both those things, I do think that's possible. It doesn't quite turn out for Frances in that way because, as I said, I just followed her story the way it went. But I myself, in a relationship with my husband, is a painter. He works very hard. I work very hard as a writer. We have 2 children. We haven't always been able to practice our own art forms at the exact same time. Like, for instance, I'm here today at the Writers' Festival. He's at home with our daughter. And that will swap and trade, and it's a very fluid kind of a thing. And for us, that works. We've both been able to have a creative life and a beautiful domestic life.
Yeah. Dee, with your books, I had a strong sense of Jakarta when I was reading The Knight, the Princess and the Falling Star.
Yes.
And I was interested, I guess, to what extent your books are really kind of referencing Indonesia. And there was this one particular character in the book, Diva, who is a very interesting character. She is a sex worker and she is very pragmatic. Like, she sees no difference in the sorts of kind of transactions that she's making as a business person. She's also a judge at a beauty pageant, and after awarding the prizes to these very precocious children, she basically says to the parents, you are, kind of commodifying your children, you are robbing them of their childhood. And I guess I was kind of interested, like, to what extent are you, I guess, holding a mirror to, say, middle-class society in Indonesia when you write?
Yeah. So at that time, when you look at the writing competition, the winner is most likely telling about the rural life in Indonesia. We don't have enough urban stories. And I think what my attempt with Supernova is just trying to add more real portrayals of the city life, of the urban people. Somehow it's interesting because most of the writers came from big cities, but what they portray most is the rural Indonesian. So the city people somewhat invisible from the literary scene at that time. So when I wrote Supernova, it's more like a very close realities that I see in my daily life. And children's beauty pageant is pretty big at that time. I had an experience to become one of the juries, and I think that's how I describe what happened to Diva, is something that I internally felt, my internal struggle when I became the jury, because I could see that the children are actually just playing along the adult commands. I believe they rehearse it at home, and they try to mimic the adult gestures and expressions. And inside I felt sorry for them. Like, oh, you don't have to do that. But they thought that was something that would get them extra points. So I just bring all those realities that happen to me in daily life and put it back in Supernova. For instance, the discussion between the homosexual couple, Dimas and Ruben, they're almost like, left brain, right brain discussion. And that's what happened to us sometimes when we, contemplate on certain subjects, and then you have your own self arguing or discussing on the matter. So I think that's what really happened in Supernova. It's just bring out the everyday portraits that I see in city life.
Yeah. And so, Laura, there's sort of similarities on the face of it, surface similarities between you and Luna. So you both have Maltese Anglo backgrounds, you both grew up in Perth, you both have an Indonesian stepmother. To what extent, do people think that you're Luna? Like, is that, to what extent do people think that you've written about yourself and your life?
Yeah, I don't think people think I'm Luna because her life is so outrageous, and mine isn't. I'm just a writer. So, but yeah, I really thought about Luna as a way of exploring my upbringing. I don't know who really has a conventional childhood, but my family situation was not super conventional. Like, my parents were never married to each other. My dad met my stepmom when I was about 6 years old, when he was working in Indonesia, and so she's been like a third parent to me for most of my life. And having an Indonesian family influence while also having Maltese heritage but being sort of disconnected from it. And my character Luna, when she's 11 years old, which is when the book begins, she goes backpacking through Europe with her mother and actually meets family in Malta for the first time. And that was really based on a real experience that I also had in my last year of primary school. My mum took me out of school and I went travelling. And so some formative moments in Luna's life are drawn from my own life, but at about the age of 16, she grows into her beauty. She is not, considered to be an attractive child, but she becomes very beautiful in her teens, and looks like a model. And I think that's where our paths sort of separate. And she gets into modelling and ends up actually using her sort of unconventional family situation and her ethnically ambiguous appearance as a Maltese Australian to market herself as Eurasian, because that's considered to be a more marketable identity in the modelling world and fashion world. And she gets her start modelling in Southeast Asia as a Eurasian woman, and yeah, I think, you know, that is such a, like, outrageous plot point that you can't confuse her life for mine, but certainly there are a lot of similarities with the early life, and, you know, giving the book to my family to read, like, my dad was reading everything that Luna's dad says as something he said, and I'm like, Dad, it's fiction, like, you didn't necessarily say that, like, so, yeah, and I think, you know, like, I had some awkward conversations with the family where my mum was like, did that really happen? And I'm just like, no, you know. Yeah, so there's a bit of myself in every story in West Girls, but sometimes the parts of myself that are in those stories are quite small. And Luna, obviously, also isn't the only character in West Girls. It's a novel in stories, so I have all these other characters who are peripheral to Luna, kind of part of her world. And I was really trying to write about Western Australia and Perth, which is not really a city I see that much in literature, in Australian literature, so it was really fun to write about it. And I think one thing I was playing with was, in Perth, it's such a small city that there are these little degrees of separation between people, and if you talk to someone for long enough, you'll find that you have people in common. So I was playing with that to have these characters who don't necessarily intersect with each other in a meaningful way, but they're sort of joined in these little, like, not obvious connections.
Yeah. So, Kylie, you're very familiar, obviously, with the art world because you're married to an artist. How much did that inform your writing? And did people from that world think that, did they recognise themselves?
They were in it. Yeah. I was a little bit concerned about that. Well, actually, my husband was more concerned about that because the character of Clem is pretty arrogant. This is the artist that my protagonist falls in love with. He's pretty arrogant and kind of could be seen as awful, really, as a partner. And he was very concerned people might think that I'd based it on him. So we had to make it clear. There's a very funny incident, actually. So I thought, I'll make sure it can't be confused with my husband, Ben. So I'll make their painting styles really different. So my husband paints with a lot of colour. It's oil paint, really big gestural marks. And so I made Clem's monochromatic, just black and white. He used drawing instead of paints. I tried really hard. And then one day I walked into my husband's studio and I looked around and he was doing all these big black and white drawings. And I said, come on, I'm trying to help you here. But yeah, so thankfully no one has really recognised themselves in the book. I never really based any character on one exact person. I mean, there's characters like Albert, who's the very sort of curmudgeonly old, slightly emotionally stunted 60-year-old male artist. I didn't have to look too far to find, you know, examples of that in the Australian art world. But I did have something strange happen because I always answer this question with no. There's nobody in the book who's sort of real. I didn't base any character on any one particular person. And I was at an event and my husband sort of put up his hand at question time. He said, well, actually you did. And I was like, did I? This is news to me. And he said, well, there's a character in the book and she's the 3-year-old daughter. And she said, that's our daughter. And our daughter is now 16. So that was not in my mind as I was writing that character, but sort of how Laura was saying and how Dee was saying, you sort of take what matters to you. You take maybe an event or a feeling or a happening and somehow it finds its way into the story. It's changed. It's not necessarily recognisable except to a few people. But it does sometimes give the story a veracity, a truth, at least to you in the writing, which hopefully then translates to the reader in the reading. So I was quite shocked by that. And so my son, who's 2 years older than her, he's 18 now, he stood up and I was like, God, all my family are asking questions now. And he said, I have one. And he said, so in your second book, will you put your son in it? So I had to agree in public in front of quite a lot of people that, yes, you will appear in the second book should I be lucky enough to have one.
I'm just wondering, do the audience, I realise that, you probably have lots of questions that you would like to ask our authors. Are there any audience questions? Yep.
Small question. Is Supernova or your other novels on sale here?
The question was, is Supernova or Dee's other novels on sale here?
I believe so. I think, but I haven't really gotten into the details yet, but usually they do. Some of the publishers already work with the committee to have the book in stock.
Yeah.
I'll check for
you.
you.
Hopefully. I think so, hopefully.
Yeah?
Yeah, I actually haven't checked. I'm not sure. I know it's available on Audible if it's not available in the bookshop.
I can say that certainly yours is Kylie and yours is Laura. And I'm not sure about yours, I'm sorry, but I noticed them this morning.
Oh.
Thank you.
Hi, as we were walking down, I'm a volunteer, as we were walking down, I was talking to you about the Romance Writers Festival that happened recently in Australia, and one of you spoke up, I'm not sure which one, said, well, I don't write romances, and I thought, well, neither do I. I wrote relationship novels, and I wondered whether or not you had that sort of notion of a difference between what traditionally is romance and what relationships novels are.
I guess traditionally I think of romance as always having a happy ending and being a feel-good genre, and I think people who really want to read romance, that is what they want a lot of the time. They don't necessarily want people to subvert the genre. They just like to know there's a couple, they get together, there's trials and tribulations, but in the end they're together. I haven't really seen many well-loved romance stories, unless they're tragedy, maybe, that aren't by that trope. But definitely West Girls, I don't really see it as a romantic book because there is so much push-pull and between the characters, and there's a lot of poisonous, things and toxicity in those relationships. So I think it's not a feel-good romance. Yeah.
Dee, do you have a view on that? The difference between sort of romance and relationship novels?
That's an interesting question because when I wrote the stories, I don't see the distinction. I just serve the story as, if it needs a love connection, a romantic, in a more a feel-good romance, if that's what that story needs, I will serve it. Mm-hmm. But if it doesn't, then I don't need to push or force it just to, I think that distinction works better for the publisher and the bookstore, so they can, categorize book in such way. But from the creator's perspective, I just serve whatever works for the books. And so sometimes it does need, a more conventional romantic relationships, man, women, and etc. But sometimes it doesn't. So I just leave it at that.
Mm. Kylie?
Yeah, I'm a little like Dee. I don't really like categorising. Well, certainly not my book. I mean, there's romance in the book, but it doesn't end well. So perhaps that doesn't fit the genre of a romance. But I just find the relationship story for me is more interesting, I suppose, than if I just approached it as I'm trying to write a romantic story. In a similar way, I'll follow where my characters go and I'll give them what they need. So if it's in my case, a very short-lived romance and then a whole life of living with the consequences and emotional effects of this, maybe 12 months, a really formative relationship. To me, that's still a romantic story, but I wouldn't call it necessarily a romance.
Yeah. Any other, sort of halfway down there.
Thank you for writing, for all the beautiful women who write beautiful literature. But I've been following the artwork of Dee Lestari for some years already. So what interests me is there are so many, like you said, weird stories, like weird love stories. Like for instance, the Recto Verso book. Like I'm really questioning where do you get that inspiration from? Because the love story in the Recto Verso is very unique. Like each story has different people with different background, different endings. Some have, most of it doesn't have good endings, but it makes it very unique. So does it come from your daily life, like you're looking at the people around you, or is it purely from your imagination, and how mixed is it?
Wow. Okay, thank you. I just answer right away? Okay. It's always a mix. And sometimes I don't see the lines anymore. So, at least from my own experience, I think I have this mechanism of like a data bank. I have like a data bank within me that I just save events, people, emotion, feelings, and it becomes like this huge, huge buffet. And you know, whenever I wanna, or huge kitchen, whenever I wanna cook something, I'll just use whatever ingredients that I need from whatever I have. But with Recto Verso, it's a rather different creative process because it's a hybrid work. So I have 11 short stories mirrored with 11 songs. And I created the stories based on the lyrics of the songs. And of course, not all songs have enough structure to become a wholesome story. So I need particular songs that can be developed into a whole story. So I chose 11 songs. Some I wrote them new, and then I created characters and a full blossom life based on the lyrics. So that's why I think Recto Verso has a different flavor, because it doesn't have an exact character. I use very seldom names, right? It was just like mother or brother or abang. It doesn't have any a name like a name. 11 stories are all like that. So in a way, I think it made them easier for people to connect themselves into the stories, because they are not interfered with real life characters. They can just identify themselves within the stories. So probably that is what you experienced, because it felt closer to you, because there are no real characters getting in the way. Thank you.
Yep, at the back. Yep, or halfway. Yep. Yeah.
I'm just curious, since you're talking about you follow the story, if each writer could discuss their process. Does it change per book, per story, especially if you follow the story?
Kylie has a very interesting process story. So I might Kylie, are you able to jump in on this one?
Yeah, a little. So I actually am a screenwriter. So for 20 years I've worked in television. So I'm very used to having a structure, working for weeks, developing the idea, knowing everything about the story before you write a single word. For the book, I did exactly the opposite. I think it was like a release from my day job, in a sense, I had a place. I had, like I mentioned, this very cold, remote mountain town where Frances, my protagonist, was going to live. I knew that. I knew she was a quiet, sort of underconfident character. And I knew I wanted it to be about a relationship between two artists, both painters. That's all I had. And then I set off. And I actually started with a short story. And then a writer friend said to me, I think that's a novel. Keep going. So I just like I said, I didn't sort of plan. I didn't, like I said, the night before I realised what the climax of the book was. I really just had no idea and was following my nose and letting the characters tell me what to do. Which, when you get to that stage, is just, for me, that was the most glorious part. Because in a sense, you're not working anymore. The characters are working for you. But it takes a long time to get there.
What about your process of writing, Dee?
I have this belief that every novel writers will get so much benefit if once in their lifetime they try to write a screenplay. And the other way around. I think a screenplay writers will do so much better if they try to write a novel at least once in their lifetime. Why? Because I think those two worlds bring out very different discipline. When you have experience as a screenplay writer, you become very much attuned with timing, with some sort of a internal navigation of what's going to happen next and when it's supposed to happen. Even though we don't have to structure it, but by building it, you have that timing, you have that efficiency in mind, not to clutter your dialogue, not to clutter your narration. And I think the other way around, if a screenplay writer, have an experience with novel, they can use that to enrich the prose, the narrative, the language, and also to beautify their scenes by applying details or some internal struggles that usually, the screenwriters have a blind spot because they're so focused on the dialogues, they're so focused on the timing, and kind of forget the elasticity of a story. So even though I'm a novel writer, I try to learn to structure stories from the screenplay writer's discipline. I even write some screenplay myself, but I know that is not my main vocation. I love writing novel because of that freedom that we have. It's unparalleled. But I think I can benefit from the screenplay.
I love that you say that. I think you are so right. It's such an insightful thing to say.
Yes,
they both feed each other, really.
True.
What about your process? So West Girls started as short stories, is that right? That you were writing when you were doing a fellowship in Jakarta?
West Girls came about very differently from my previous books because my first 3 books were all in some way inspired by true historical events or true crime. And West Girls, I kind of did not do that. And I also didn't really know what I was writing until I had a full manuscript at the end and gave it to my editor and was like, I hope this looks like a book to you because usually I write with a much more plan and structure and know what's going to happen. And West Girls was just written, I wrote pieces of it out of order. And the earliest stories in West Girls were written in Jakarta in 2017. I think I had about 3 stories that are in West Girls, which the first drafts I wrote during that time. But I completed the manuscript in early 2023, actually, so it was quite a quick publication after that. And it was very much less of a plan than usual for me, and I knew vaguely the structure that I wanted, which is one story from Luna's perspective, one from somebody else, but then it ends with Caitlin sort of looking at Luna, so she's the last story of the collection. And I think not having a plan was really freeing in a way because I didn't really know what I was writing, and I was just doing the thing of maybe not necessarily knowing where the story was going as much. And for instance, Caitlin and Luna, that relationship was actually something that I didn't necessarily plan from the outset. It was more when I had these characters begin talking to each other and interacting, I realized that there was this attraction and that became a central relationship. So Yeah, I highly recommend breaking with your own form sometimes, and just you may think you're a writer who plans, but then you can also just, go a bit chaotic, and it can work out.
So with the structure that you presented to the manuscript that you presented to the publisher and said, I'm not sure if did it change much from that, or?
Not really, because they had seen bits and pieces of it, and I sold it in a 2-book deal, I think in 2022, where they had seen maybe more than half of it, and I just said, these are some stories I plan to write, this is what I think will go in them. And that did change a little bit, but when I handed the manuscript over, it was more like, okay, now we got to get to editing and get it ready for publication, because it was actually originally meant to be published in 2024, but then a slot opened in the publisher's schedule in 2023, and they're like, do you think you can have it ready? And I'm like, yeah, I can try. So.
Wow, that's unusual, isn't it? Normally it gets pushed back,
unusual,
not forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Hi, my name is Anika. I'm from Jakarta, and I noticed that in all 3 of your works, although you commonly explored love, you also explored love that challenged social norms and also the status quo. So with that, I wanted to ask, at the time, how did you receive the push or have the motivation and courage to publish works that were so unconventional? And in the present, how do you feel seeing the impact of your works, either towards or even against the status quo? Thank you.
Against or, sorry, the last sentence?
How do you feel seeing the impact of your works, either towards or against the status quo?
Oh, okay. The status quo, okay. So I think at that time, I published my work because I didn't know better. So I always have this fantasy when I was small that I'm going to see my book sold in a bookstore on a shelf. That's my innocent fantasy. And so when I was approaching 25 years old, I think I had a quarter-life crisis. Like, okay, I'm about to turn 25. What should I do? What big gesture should I create to to show the world? And I'm 25 years old, because some of my friends, they climb the Kilimanjaro, solo climbing. They did this. They traveled to whatever place. So, okay. Then I remember that fantasy when I was small. Maybe I should revisit that, having my book published on a bookstore. So I published Supernova because of that. I was just going to give myself a birthday gift, to satisfy the 8-year-old Dee Lestari and see her book in the bookstores. That's it. So I self-published. I didn't go to any publisher because I have a deadline, and the deadline is my 25th birthday, which falls on the January 2001. So, and I finished the manuscript around September. So I only have short time. So I gathered whatever money that I have in my bank account. I went to the printing shop, and I told them, I have this X amount of money. How many books can I get from that? And he said, 5,000 books. All right, let's do 5,000. And I didn't have any imagination what 5,000 books look like. How many are there actually, and when you see it physically, I just see the numbers. Okay, 5,000 works, all right. And so when I came up with 7,000 books, because the 5,000, again, out of my unknowingness, it was not perfect, Some of I have footnotes in my novel. The footnotes that for page 18 appeared in page 25. So, oh my God. And, I'm a perfectionist, so I cannot live with that mistake. And I said, okay, I gather again some money and said, all right, I have this X amount of money. How many printings did I get? 2,000. So I ended up 7,000 books, self-published. And that was so crazy. I thought I'm gonna sell my book from my car trunk until I'm old, I'm going to some pop-up store and then just, open up my trunk, my books, and all of a sudden, that's how I imagined, because then when I published the extra 2,000, I went to the printing shop, and that's for the first time I saw what 2,000 books look like. So I can imagine, oh my God, what does the 5,000 looks like? It can fill up a swimming pool, literally. Yeah, so that's how I started. It was so innocent, kind of foolish, but somehow it works. And it was miraculous, I must say. So I didn't really care about how people would react to that. Honestly, it was just a birthday gift for myself. I don't advise you to do that because it's so risky, dangerous. It can, we can end up in a financial crisis. But yeah, it turns out I was safe. So I didn't think much about the impact. Maybe not until I wrote my fifth book, 6 books. Then I started to realize when people came up to me and said, your book changed my life. I said, really? And they have this personal relationship with the book. And I think that is beyond me. That is beyond me as a writer. I think in many ways in creative process, I felt like I'm just a medium. Something else that is bigger than me is trying to communicate with bigger audience, and that happened just using me as the medium. But it's sometimes when I see Supernova, I don't feel like it's my creation anymore. I started to see the distance between me and my own work. Like I couldn't be writing that. Who was that? Who was it? And I keep feeling that way until even my latest book. I started to grow distance and grow extra distance from it and see it. Oh, okay, this is just another a bigger work that took place, and I'm just the middleman.
What about the reaction, though, to the homosexuality? Like at the time, I think it's still not legal.
I was so lucky
here.
at the time because now I think we have a more conservative society with a stronger voice against homosexuality. I think at that time, because it was the change of political situation, and people started to feel more expressive. Books like Saman, and then another books from Jenar Maesa Ayu is very vocal about sexuality, and people are just okay with it. Okay? They talked about it, but not in a way that let's burn these books. Not in that way. I never had that such strong, an extreme reaction. Mm-hmm. I cannot really imagine if I publish it now, it probably get different reaction. Especially now we have social media. It's really easy to flame other people and making one issue exaggerated. But at that time, I was just safe, I guess.
What about you, Laura? Did you feel like you were challenging conventions of sexuality?
I guess in the sense that I'm writing about queer characters, but who aren't necessarily outwardly identifying as queer. And I think often there's an expectation when you are writing about love between 2 women that these women will be perfect feminists and that there'll be women who just, love women generally, and that there won't be any internalized misogyny. But I was really interested in exploring the coexistence of internalized misogyny with, attraction and love, because that's something I hadn't really seen that much of. And I think, there is, I think, often a desire for queer stories to always be uplifting and to show queer characters as good people fighting against an unfair society. And I think you can show the complexity of people, including queer people, without presenting society as a benevolent force at the same time. So I think that was something that I was writing against, was the expectations for what a queer story should be. And I think the fact that I didn't actually set out to write that, it just sort of happened as I had the characters in the room with each other, made it happen quite naturally. But yeah, it's something that I think has resonated, at least with women of my generation. I think a lot of us have that experience growing up where, like, you know, there's another girl and, like, you don't know if you want to be her friend or you want to be her or you just want her. So exploring that space, which I think is a really interesting space to play with.
Yeah. Kylie, did you feel like you were challenging conventional notions of love?
No, I mean, I certainly didn't set out to in the same way. I didn't quite realise. This is my first book, so there was never an assumption it would be published. So I could just write in my own bubble, and it was only once I realised it was actually going to be a book, and particularly because I'd written about the Australian art world very objectively, I hope. I remember I got the advance proof, and my uncle was reading it, and I just saw him shaking his head and making little notes. And I thought, oh my God. He said, Kylie, I don't think you can say that. And I'm not sure about you saying this. And I suddenly thought, oh my God, is this going to upset people?
What was it? Which bits did he...
Well, there's things, you know, critical of art critics, critical of older male artists, critical of art collectors, critical of the commodification of art. The book is quite critical in that sense because I'm really taking it from the perspective of a young female artist trying to make her way in a very male-dominated art form, and historically has been so. And so it's sort of tapping into that trope, I suppose. But from a love perspective, no, I think I just really wanted to write, in some ways, quite a conventional love story in the sense that I think many of us can look back and there was some relationship, perhaps short-lived, but very formative from our young life. And I wanted to have a character reflecting on that from a different position as a middle-aged woman. So some people have called it a coming-of-age story. It's almost a coming-of-middle-age story. It's about a grown-up woman.
Yeah.
Finding her voice, really.
I think that we've run out of time, but thank you very much for coming along. Thank you very much to the panel.
So much.
It's been a really fabulous session, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.